long before the first church bell rang across the Slavic lands, before priests carried crosses into birch forests and river valleys, the people who lived along the Volga, the Dnieper, the Vistula, and 1,000 smaller streams already knew that water held more than fish and reflection. They knew that some nights, when the moon hung low and heavy over a still pond, the surface would break, not with the splash of a leaping carp, but with the slow, deliberate rise of a pale arm, a curtain of wet hair, a face achingly beautiful and achingly sad. They called her Rusalka. To understand the Rusalka, we must first understand that she was never simply a monster and never simply a ghost. She was something stranger, a being caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither the living nor the dead, neither entirely human nor entirely spirit. In the oldest tellings, found in the village folklore of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and the Czech lands, the Rusalka was almost always once a woman, a young woman, more often than not, a bride who never reached her wedding day, a girl betrayed by a lover, an unbaptized infant left in the woods, or a woman who took her own life in sorrow by walking into a river and never walking out. Death by water, especially death touched by grief or injustice, was the thread that bound her to this fate. The water did not simply take her body, it transformed her. Picture, if you will, a quiet pond at the edge of a rye field in the early hours before dawn. Mist curls along the surface like breath. And there, half submerged among the lily pads, a Rusalka waits. She is rarely depicted as monstrous in form, quite the opposite. Most accounts describe her as strikingly lovely, with long flowing hair the color of moss or pale gold, skin as white as birch bark, and eyes that seemed to hold the entire depth of the river behind them. It was this beauty that made her so dangerous. For the Rusalka's true nature revealed itself only in her purpose, and her purpose, in the oldest and darkest versions of the tale, was to lure. Fishermen returning home at dusk, young men walking too close to the riverbank after a night of drinking, even children who wandered too near the water's edge, the Rusalka would sing, and her voice, by every account, was unbearably beautiful, capable of unraveling a person's will entirely. She would call them closer, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with weeping, sometimes simply by combing her long hair and waiting for curiosity to do the rest. And when they came close enough, she would draw them down into the water, down past the reeds and the silt, down to where the light could no longer reach. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Some tales say she sought to drown them outright. Others, gentler in their telling, say she only wished for company, that her loneliness in the space between worlds was so vast that she could not bear to be there alone any longer. This is, perhaps, the most important thing to understand about the Rusalka. She was never purely a villain. She was a figure of profound tragedy, wrapped in the shape of a warning. To the peasant communities who told these stories around fires and across kitchen tables for centuries, the Rusalka represented something deeply human. The unfinished business of a life cut short, the danger of unspoken grief, the way water itself seemed to hold memory and consequence. She was a reminder that nature was not simply scenery. It was alive, it was watching, and it remembered every drowned girl the village had failed to save. And so she existed, in the imagination of the Slavic countryside, not in some distant other world, but in the very rivers, lakes, and ponds that people depended on for their survival. She lived in the water they drank, the water they fished, the water their children played beside. This proximity is precisely what made her so enduring as a legend. She was not a creature confined to mountaintops or far-off forests, but something that might be waiting tonight in the pond just beyond your village. For now, simply listen to the water and remember, She is listening too. The origins of the Rusalka reach back further than most listeners might expect, back past the wooden churches and Orthodox icons, back past even the earliest written chronicles of the Slavic peoples, into a world that had no name for itself yet. A world we now simply call pre-Christian Slavic belief. To understand where she came from, we have to set aside for a moment the image of the drowned bride weeping by the riverbank. That image, vivid and tragic as it is, came later. Before her, there was something older, something stranger. And to find it, we must look not at a woman, but at water itself. In the earliest layers of Slavic spirituality, long before Kievan Rusas adopted Christianity in the late 10th century, the natural world was understood to be thoroughly, unapologetically alive. Rivers were not simply geographic features. They were thresholds. Forests were not simply wood and root. They were dwelling places, and the spirits who inhabited these spaces were neither good nor evil in the way later religious frameworks would insist upon. They simply were, the way weather simply is, the way winter simply arrives without asking permission. Among these spirits were beings tied specifically to water, a vast and loosely organized family of entities that some folklorists believe predate the very concept of the Rusalka as we know her today. Some scholars argue that the earliest Rusalki were not human spirits at all, but nature spirits in their own right, beings connected to fertility, to the life-giving properties of water that nourished crops, filled wells, and sustained entire villages through the growing season. In this older interpretation, the Rusalka was something closer to a vegetation spirit, intimately tied to the cycle of planting and harvest. Her presence in a river or field, a sign that the water itself was fertile, generous, willing to give life to the rye and the wheat. This theory finds support in the timing of her most important festival, which we will come to shortly, and in the curious fact that in some regions, particularly in parts of Ukraine and southern Russia, Rusalki was said to bring not death, but abundance, running through the fields at night to encourage the crops to grow tall, dancing in circles that left the grain thicker and greener wherever their feet had touched the earth. And yet, layered over this older agricultural spirit, almost like silt settling over a riverbed, came the second and far more widely known origin story, the one we touched upon in our opening. The Rusalka is the spirit of a woman who died before her time, and specifically, died in or near water. This is what folklorists call an unclean death, or in the old Slavic understanding, a death that left the soul without proper rest. A young woman who drowned, whether by accident, by despair, or by violence, was believed to be unable to pass fully into the realm of the ancestors. She was caught, suspended between the living world and the world of the dead, unable to enter either completely. The water that took her life became her new home, and in becoming her home, it became part of her. Some tellings go further still, insisting that any woman who died unmarried, regardless of how she died, risked this same fate. Her unfulfilled potential for marriage and motherhood leaving her spiritually unanchored, a wandering soul, the old folklore called by many names depending on the region, Rusalka in the north and east, Bila in the southern Slavic lands, Navka or Mavka among Ukrainian villages, each name carrying slightly different shades of meaning, but all describing some version of the same haunting truth. What is fascinating, and this is something every careful historian of folklore must sit with, is that these two origins, the ancient fertility spirit and the tragic drowned woman, were never fully separated in the popular imagination. They blurred together, layer over layer, the way oral tradition always blurs things over centuries of retelling. By the time we reach the more thoroughly documented folklore of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Rusalka had become a being who was simultaneously a dead girl and a force of nature, simultaneously tragic and dangerous, simultaneously connected to grief and to growth. She did not need to choose one identity. The villagers who feared and respected her certainly never asked her to. This brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire Rusalka tradition, the idea that she was not a year-round presence but a seasonal one. Across the Slavic lands, there existed a specific window of time each year when the boundary between the world of water spirits and the world of the living was believed to grow thin, almost porous, allowing the Rusalki to leave their rivers and lakes entirely and walk freely upon the land. This period was known by various names depending on the region. Rusalnaya Nedelia, or Rusalka week in Russian tradition, often falling in early summer around the time of the Christian feast of Pentecost, a period also called Semic, or Green Week in older agrarian custom. During this week, villagers believed the Rusalki rose from the depths of their rivers and ponds and moved through the fields, the forests, and even the edges of the villages themselves. They were said to swing from the branches of birch trees, their favorite tree, the white bark said to remind them of their own pale skin. They danced in circles in the tall grass, leaving behind rings of unusually green growth that locals would point to for years afterward as proof of where the spirits had passed. And critically, during this week, the normal rules of safety around water were suspended entirely. It was considered extraordinarily dangerous to swim, to wash clothes by the riverbank, or even to walk too close to open water, because the Rusalki were no longer confined to the depths. They were everywhere, and their hunger for company, for connection, for the warmth of the living world they had been torn from, was said to be at its absolute peak. Villagers responded to this seasonal threat with an entire structure of protective custom. Offerings were left at the water's edge, eggs, bread, and woven garlands tossed into rivers and ponds as a kind of peace offering, an acknowledgement of the spirit's presence, and a plea to be left undisturbed. Garlic and wormwood, believed to ward off malevolent spirits throughout Slavic folk tradition, were sometimes worn or hung near doorways during Rusalka week, specifically because of the heightened danger. Young women, in particular, were warned to stay close to home, as it was believed the Rusalki held a special, almost possessive fascination with the living women who reminded them of the lives and the loves they themselves had lost. And perhaps most poignantly, in many villages, the final day of Rusalka week was marked by a ritual known as seeing off the Rusalka, a ceremony in which villagers would construct a straw effigy of the spirit, carry it in procession through the fields accompanied by singing, and then ultimately tear it apart or burn it at the village boundary, a symbolic act meant to escort the wandering spirits back to the water before the window between worlds closed once more for another year. There is something deeply moving in this ritual, something that reveals far more about the people who practiced it than it does about the spirits they feared. To construct a figure of grief, to walk it through your fields with song, and to release it back to the water with something resembling tenderness rather than pure terror. This tells us that the Rusalka was never simply an enemy to be vanquished. She was acknowledged. She was, in her own unsettling way, mourned alongside being feared. The ritual was not an exorcism. It was closer to a farewell. Travel west from the Russian heartland, follow the rivers down through Ukraine, into the Carpathian foothills, across into Poland and the Czech lands, and south into Serbia and Bulgaria, and you'll discover something that every careful student of folklore eventually learns. She does not stay the same. The Rusalka was never a single, fixed creature with a tidy catalogue of traits. She was a regional inheritance, reshaped again and again by the particular rivers, forests, and fears of whatever community happened to be telling her story. To understand her fully, we cannot simply ask what a Rusalka is. We must ask what a Rusalka was in this village, along this river, in this particular century. And the answers, gathered together, paint a picture far richer and stranger than any single legend could hold on its own. Let us begin where her name is most familiar, the Russian north, along the Volga and its countless tributaries. Here, the Rusalka of folk memory is overwhelmingly a water-bound spirit, rarely straying far from the river or lake that birthed her, unless called out by the seasonal thinning of Rusalka week. She is most often described as pale, almost translucent, her skin carrying the faint blue-white tint of something that has spent too long beneath the surface. Her hair is long, frequently green or the color of riverweed rather than the gold or chestnut brown we might expect from a human woman, and in many tellings this hair is inseparable from her power. She must keep it wet at all times, and stories caution that a Rusalka caught in sunlight with dry hair will lose her strength entirely, becoming as vulnerable as any mortal woman. This single detail, small as it seems, tells us something important even at her most dangerous. The Rusalka remained bound by rules, by limitations, by a logic the villagers believed they could understand and, if necessary, exploit. Move southwest into Ukraine, however, and the legend shifts its shape considerably. Here she takes on the name Mavka, or sometimes Navka, and while the water remains important, an entirely new domain opens to her: the forest. The Ukrainian Mavka is frequently described not as a creature confined to rivers and ponds, but as a being equally at home among birch trees and forest clearings, her presence tied as much to the woodland as to the water that bore her. Folklorists studying this distinction have offered a compelling explanation. In many Ukrainian tellings, particularly across the Carpathian regions, the Mavka's origin was not exclusively drowning at all, but specifically infant death. Children who died unbaptized, before the church could claim their souls for the Christian afterlife, were believed in older folk cosmology to transform into these forest and water spirits, doomed to wander the natural world in a kind of eternal, suspended childhood. This is perhaps one of the most quietly devastating variations in the entire tradition, and it reveals something the Rusalka legend so often circles back to, no matter where it is told: a deep cultural anxiety about death that arrives too early, about lives interrupted before they could properly begin. There is a haunting visual detail that appears specifically in many Ukrainian and Belarusian tellings of the Mavka, one worth pausing on. In some versions, she appears entirely ordinary from the front, a lovely young woman, indistinguishable from any village girl. But viewed from behind, her body reveals the truth of what she is. Her back is hollow or transparent, or in the most unsettling tellings, simply missing entirely, exposing her internal organs to anyone unfortunate enough to glimpse her from that angle. This detail, so visceral and strange, served a very practical narrative function within the folklore. A warning, almost a survival instruction, that beauty alone could never be trusted as proof of safety. One had to look closer. One had to look from every angle before believing what stood before them. Travel further still, into the lands of the southern Slavs, modern Serbia, Bulgaria, Croatia, and the broader Balkan region, and we encounter a transformation so significant that some folklorists hesitate to even group her with her northern cousins. Here she is known as the Vila, and the Vila is, in many crucial respects, an entirely different kind of being, far less consistently tied to drowning or to tragic death. The Vila of southern Slavic tradition is more frequently described as a spirit of mountains, clouds, and wild places generally, often depicted not as malevolent at all, but as a noble, even helpful figure, a protector of nature who might aid a worthy hero, teach him hidden knowledge, or fight alongside him against his enemies, provided he treated her and the natural world she guarded with appropriate respect. The Vila of Serbian epic poetry, for instance, frequently appears as a fierce, skilled warrior in her own right, a far cry from the weeping, vengeful, drowned bride of the Russian rivers. Some scholars believe the Vila represents an older, less Christianized layer of Slavic belief, one that retained more of its pre-Christian complexity, precisely because the Balkans, with their unique religious and political history, absorbed church influence more slowly and unevenly than the lands further north. This regional variation raises one of the great ongoing debates among folklorists who study the Rusalka tradition. Was the Rusalka, in her earliest and truest form meant to be feared, or has centuries of Christian moralizing gradually darkened a figure who was once understood quite differently? The Russian folklorist Dmitry Zelenin, writing in the early 20th century, proposed an influential theory that the Rusalka belonged to a broader category he called the unclean dead. Souls whose manner of death, whether by suicide, murder, or simply dying without the proper rites, left them unable to rest and therefore dangerous to the living. Under this framework, the Rusalka's menace was not incidental to her character, but absolutely central to it. She was frightening because the church and community needed her to be frightening, needed a clear moral lesson embedded in her story about the dangers of unbaptized death, of suicide, of women who died outside the sanctioned order of marriage and motherhood. Fear, in this reading, was the entire point. A tool the community used to reinforce its own values about how a proper life and a proper death ought to unfold. But other folklorists, looking at the same evidence, particularly the agricultural blessings attributed to her in Ukrainian wheat fields and the noble, protective character of the southern villa, have argued the opposite. That fear was layered on top of an older reverence, not built from nothing. In this view, the Rusalka began as something closer to sacred than sinister, a spirit whose connection to water and fertility made her essential to a community's survival, and only gradually, as Christianity sought to displace the old pagan reverence for nature spirits, did she become recast as a temptress, a danger, a cautionary tale told to frighten children away from riverbanks and young women away from despair. The fear, in other words, may have been the church's contribution. The reverence may have been the original truth. We may never resolve this debate entirely, and perhaps we are not meant to. What we can say with confidence, having now traveled from the Volga to the Carpathians to the Balkan Mountains, is that the Rusalka was never a single fixed idea, waiting patiently in the water for someone to write her down correctly. She was a living tradition, reshaped by every village that needed her, every mother who used her story to keep a child from wandering too close to a dangerous current, every poet and storyteller who found in her watery grief a reflection of their own community's losses. She was, in the truest sense, a mirror, and what each region saw reflected in her depended entirely on what that region most needed to understand about death, about water, and about the women whose lives the water had taken. If you had been born in a small village along the central Russian rivers 2 or 3 centuries ago, the Rusalka would not have been a story told to frighten you on dark nights, and then forgotten by morning. She would have been woven into the practical rhythm of your entire year, into when you fetched water, into what plants your grandmother kept hanging by the door, into the songs the older women sang while doing the wash, into the very calendar that told you when it was safe to swim and when it was not. Belief in this world was never separate from daily life. It was daily life. And so the protective customs that grew up around the Rusalka tell us, perhaps more clearly than any single legend could, exactly how seriously these communities took her presence among them. The first and most fundamental rule was simple: know the dangerous hours. Just as Rusalka Week marked a dangerous season, certain times of day were considered perilous for approaching open water, regardless of the time of year. Noon, oddly enough, was one such hour, a time when the sun stood directly overhead and shadows briefly vanished, a moment many Slavic folk traditions associated with thinning boundaries between worlds, not unlike midnight in other European folklore. Midday swimming, particularly for children and unmarried women, was often discouraged for exactly this reason. Midnight, predictably, carried its own warnings, and any villager foolish enough to walk alone near a riverbank in the deep hours of night without good reason was understood to be tempting fate in the most literal sense. Beyond simply avoiding dangerous times, villagers armed themselves, quite literally, in some cases, with specific plants believed to repel the Rusalka's influence. Wormwood, known in Russian as pollen, held a particularly important place in this protective arsenal. Its bitter, pungent scent was believed to be intolerable to Rusalki and other unclean spirits, and it was common practice during Rusalka week, specifically to tuck sprigs of wormwood into windowsills, hang it above door frames, or even carry it on one's person when work required going near water. Garlic served a similar function, its sharp smell believed to ward off not just Rusalki, but a whole category of malevolent or restless spirits throughout Slavic folk tradition more broadly. There is something worth noticing here, something almost universal about how human communities respond to invisible threats. We reach for the senses we trust most. If a danger cannot be seen, we arm ourselves with what can be smelled, tasted, felt against the skin, as though the nose and the tongue might succeed where the eyes have failed. Iron, too, carried protective weight, as it does across an enormous range of European folklore traditions. A needle pinned to clothing, a knife placed beneath a doorstep, an iron object kept near where laundry was washed by the river. All were believed to create a kind of barrier the Rusalka could not easily cross. And as Christianity layered itself over these older customs, the protective vocabulary expanded further still. The sign of the cross, made before entering water, a quietly murmured prayer, a small icon carried in a pocket. These Christian elements did not replace the older pagan caution so much as join it, creating a hybrid system of protection where a villager might genuinely believe that crossing themselves and carrying wormwood offered complementary, rather than contradictory, forms of safety. This blending, which folklorists call diva-wevery, or dual faith, defined Slavic religious life for centuries, and the Rusalka tradition is one of its clearest surviving examples. But protection was not only about repelling her. It was, just as often, about appeasing her, about acknowledging her presence with something closer to respect than fear. And here the customs grow considerably more tender. Throughout Rusalka week, particularly in the days surrounding Semic and the Christian Feast of Trinity, Sunday that often followed close behind it, women and girls would gather woven garlands made of fresh flowers and birch branches and carry them down to the water's edge. Some garlands were worn during ritual dances performed specifically for the season. Others were tossed directly into the river or pond as offerings. A small act of generosity extended toward the spirit believed to be watching, waiting, perhaps lonelier than anyone cared to fully admit. The birch tree itself deserves particular attention here, because few elements of the Rusalka tradition reveal her layered, contradictory nature quite so clearly. We have already mentioned that Rusalki were believed to favor birch trees, swinging from their branches during their week of freedom upon the land. Villagers responded to this belief not merely with caution, but with an entire ritual practice built around it. Young women would venture into the birch groves during Semic, select a particular tree, and decorate it with ribbons, garlands, and strips of colorful cloth, treating the tree almost as a stand-in for the Rusalka herself. In certain regions, a custom known as kumleni took place, in which two girls would bend the branches of a young birch into an arch, kiss through the gap formed by the bent branches, and exchange small tokens or vows of friendship beneath it. A ritual meant to forge a kind of spiritual sisterhood, performed specifically under the Rusalka's favorite tree, during her favorite week, as though inviting her gently to witness and bless the bond being formed. It is a remarkable detail, worth sitting with for a moment. Even as villagers feared what the Rusalka might do to them by the water's edge, young women were simultaneously inviting her, quite deliberately, into one of the most tender rituals of their own friendships. This tension between fear and tenderness reached its fullest expression in the closing ceremony of Rusalka week, the seeing off of the Rusalka. In village after village across the Russian and Ukrainian countryside, the final day of this dangerous week was marked by the construction of a straw effigy, sometimes shaped vaguely like a woman, sometimes simply a bundle of birch branches and rags dressed in old clothing. This effigy, treated with surprising ceremony, would be carried by a procession of village women through the fields and along the paths the Rusalki were believed to have walked during their time above water, accompanied the entire way by singing specific songs passed down through generations, whose lyrics spoke directly to the spirit, sometimes pleading with her to return to the water peacefully, sometimes expressing something that sounds remarkably like genuine sorrow at her departure. The procession would typically end at the boundary of the village or at the water's edge itself, where the effigy met one of several fates depending on regional custom. In some villages, it was torn apart by the procession, its pieces scattered across the fields as a kind of symbolic dispersal of the spirit's lingering presence. In others, it was burned, the smoke believed to carry whatever remained of the Rusalka's influence safely away from the community. And in perhaps the most poignant variation practiced in parts of Ukraine, the effigy was carried not to be destroyed at all, but to be ceremonially buried or floated upon the water, a gesture far closer to a funeral than an exorcism, as though the village were finally giving this restless spirit the proper burial rites that her original, tragic death had denied her centuries before. It is worth pausing here to consider what these rituals tell us, beneath all their folkloric detail. A community does not invent a yearly funeral for a creature it purely despises. It does not weave garlands for something it wishes only to destroy. The protective customs surrounding the Rusalka, taken as a whole, reveal a relationship far more complicated than simple fear, something closer to an uneasy, ongoing negotiation between the living and the dead, between the village and the water that sustained it, between the comfort of explanation and the reality of grief that could never be fully resolved. The Rusalka was dangerous, yes, but she was also, in some quiet way, the villagers themselves may never have fully articulated, one of their own, a daughter, a sister, a bride who never reached her wedding day, still owed, even in her transformed and frightening state, the basic dignity of being properly mourned. By the time we reached the 19th century, the Rusalka had already lived a long life in the imagination of ordinary villagers, sung about, feared, ritually escorted back to her waters year after year by women carrying straw effigies through summer fields. But a new kind of attention was beginning to find her, one that would carry her far beyond the rivers of her birth and into concert halls, painted canvases, and the printed pages of some of the era's most celebrated writers. The Rusalka was about to become something she had never quite been before, not merely a village belief, passed mouth to mouth across generations, but a deliberate work of art, shaped by individual hands who saw in her story something universal enough to outlast the specific rivers and villages that first gave her form. Perhaps no single figure did more to plant the Rusalka firmly in the literary imagination than Alexander Pushkin, the poet so often regarded as the father of modern Russian literature. In the early 19th century, Pushkin began work on a dramatic poem simply titled Rusalka, drawing directly from the folk material we have spent this journey exploring. A miller's daughter, betrayed and abandoned by a prince who promised to marry her, who drowns herself in despair and rises again as a Rusalka, her grief transformed into something both sorrowful and quietly menacing. Pushkin never finished the work. He died in a duel before completing the final scenes, and the play exists today as a fragment, tantalizing scholars with the question of how he might have resolved his heroine's fate. Yet, even unfinished, Pushkin's Rusalka accomplished something significant. It took a figure who had existed primarily in oral village tradition and gave her literary legitimacy, proving that her story carried the same emotional weight, the same tragic architecture, as the great romantic narratives of betrayal and revenge populating the rest of European literature at the time. It was this same fragment of Pushkin's that, decades later, captured the attention of the composer Alexander Dargomashsky, who completed and adapted the unfinished play into a full opera, premiered in 1856, helping cement the Rusalka's place within Russian musical tradition. But it is a different opera, composed roughly half a century later by a Czech composer working entirely outside the Russian tradition, that would ultimately become the Rusalka's most enduring and beloved artistic incarnation. In 1901, Antonin Dvořák premiered his opera simply titled Rusalka, drawing not from Pushkin, but from a constellation of Central European folk sources, blended with literary influences including Hans Christian Andersen's Tale of a Mermaid Who Longs to Become Human, and the German romantic tradition of water spirits seeking mortal love. Dvořák's Rusalka is, in many ways, a gentler creature than her folkloric ancestors, not a vengeful spirit luring men to their deaths, but a water nymph who falls in love with a human prince and longs desperately to become mortal herself, willing to sacrifice her voice and her very nature for the chance at human love. The opera's emotional centerpiece, an aria in which Rusalka addresses the moon and asks it to carry word of her love to the prince she cannot yet speak to, has become one of the most recognized and frequently performed pieces in the entire operatic repertoire. Sung in concert halls worldwide by sopranos who may never have heard of Rusalnaya Nedelia or the straw effigies once carried through Russian fields. It is worth pausing on this transformation, because it tells us something about how folklore travels and changes as it crosses from village belief into formal art. Dvořák's Rusalka is tragic, yes, but her tragedy is romantic rather than vengeful, more aligned with the doomed lovers of European fairy tale tradition than with the unsettling, ambiguous danger of the original Slavic water spirit. The teeth, so to speak, had been softened, the grief remained, but the menace had been gently set aside in favor of yearning. Literature, too, continued to find new uses for her. In Ukraine, the playwright and poet Lesia Ukrainka, writing at the turn of the 20th century, composed a dramatic poem titled Forest Song, centering not on the Rusalka exactly, but on the closely related Mavka we encountered earlier. Ukrainka's Mavka is a forest spirit who falls in love with a mortal man, and the resulting drama explores themes of nature's purity set against human compromise and betrayal, becoming one of the most treasured works in the entire Ukrainian literary canon and a frequent subject of stage and screen adaptation in Ukraine to this day. Earlier still, Nikolai Gogol, that master of Ukrainian Russian Gothic storytelling, wove a Rusalka like Drowned Maiden into his story. May Night, or The Drowned Maiden, part of his celebrated collection. Evenings on a Farm, near Dekanka, blending folk horror with comedy in a way that captured the strange dual nature of village belief, simultaneously frightening and absurd, sacred and silly, depending on which neighbor happened to be telling the story that evening. Visual artists, too, found themselves drawn to her. The Russian painter Ivan Krumskoy, working in the latter half of the 19th century, produced a haunting canvas depicting a group of Rusalki rising from misty water beneath moonlight, their pale figures emerging from fog in a composition that captured, perhaps better than any written description could, the eerie liminal beauty the folklore had always insisted upon. Other painters of the period, including Konstantin Makovsky, similarly turned their brushes toward riverbank scenes thick with atmosphere and ambiguous danger, contributing to a broader artistic movement across 19th century Europe that found water spirits, drowned maidens, and ambiguous nature deities endlessly compelling subjects, a fascination shared by painters working on entirely separate national traditions, from the pre-Raphaelites in England to the symbolists across the European continent, and she has not stopped traveling since. In the contemporary era, the Rusalka and her closely related cousins have found their way into fantasy literature and gaming culture far beyond the borders of the Slavic world. The Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski, whose Witcher novels and the wildly popular video game series they inspired drew extensively on Slavic folklore for his fictional bestiary, and water hags bearing unmistakable Rusalka characteristics appear throughout that world, luring travelers toward rivers and ponds in scenes that any student of the original folklore would recognize immediately. Beyond Sapkowski's work, the broader explosion of interest in Slavic folklore within fantasy fiction, horror cinema, and tabletop gaming over the past 2 decades has introduced the Rusalka to audiences who may never have encountered the original village traditions, refracting her once again through entirely new artistic lenses, each generation finding in her story whatever resonance it most needs. There is, too, a quieter but meaningful thread running through more recent decades, a feminist re-examination of the Rusalka tradition undertaken by scholars and creative writers alike, who have asked pointed questions about what it means that so much of Slavic folklore channeled its anxiety about death, grief, and female suffering into figures of feminine danger. Why, these scholars ask, did a drowned, betrayed, or grieving woman so often become something to be feared rather than something to be mourned outright? Reframed through this lens, the Rusalka becomes less a cautionary tale about dangerous women and more a haunting metaphor for the silencing and erasure so often imposed upon women's grief throughout history. Her song beautiful precisely because, in life, she may never have been permitted to be heard at all. From an unfinished poem by a duelist who never lived to complete it, to an aria sung beneath gilded opera house ceilings, to forest spirits wandering through 21st century fantasy novels and video games, the Rusalka has proven remarkably resilient in her ability to transform alongside the cultures that continue telling her story. She has been softened into romance and sharpened into horror. She has been mourned, reclaimed, and reinvented more times than any single village elder, singing her story by firelight centuries ago, could ever have imagined. Drive far enough from any major city in Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus today, beyond the reach of paved roads and reliable internet, and you will eventually arrive in a village where the Rusalka has never entirely left. Not in the sense that anyone there will swear with perfect conviction that pale spirits rise from the local pond each June. Belief rarely survives that cleanly into the modern age. But ask the right grandmother in the right village about the water at the edge of town, and you may still hear a pause before she answers. A small hesitation, a flicker of something inherited rather than reasoned, before she tells you that her own grandmother always said not to swim there after dark, and that she has simply never seen a reason to test whether the old woman was right. This is, perhaps, the truest answer to the question of whether the Rusalka still exists. Ethnographers and folklorists who have conducted fieldwork across rural Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland well into the 21st century have consistently found something remarkable. While almost no one today claims to have personally encountered a Rusalka, the protective customs surrounding her, the caution around water during early summer, the lingering unease about swimming alone at dusk, the half-joking, half-serious warnings passed from grandmother to grandchild, persist far longer than the explicit belief that originally justified them. Folklorists call this phenomenon ostension residue, the way ritual behavior can outlive the literal belief that first produced it, becoming simply how things are done, a habit worn smooth by generations until no one quite remembers or needs to remember why. The grandmother in a village outside Vologda or Poltava may no longer believe, in any literal sense, that a green-haired spirit waits in the mill pond, but she will still tell her grandchildren not to swim there during the week after Trinity Sunday, and the grandchildren, more often than not, will listen, because some warnings simply feel true in the body, even after the mind has stopped fully crediting the explanation behind them. And in certain places, the old festivals have not faded at all, but transformed into something between folk memory and cultural celebration. Ivan Kupala Night, the Slavic midsummer festival traditionally celebrated in late June or early July, remains widely observed across Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, drawing direct lineage from the same pre-Christian seasonal beliefs that gave rise to Rusalka Week. Bonfires are still lit and leapt over by young couples, a custom said to test and strengthen romantic bonds, and in a practice that connects directly back to the waters we have spent this journey exploring. Young women still gather along riverbanks on this night to weave floral wreaths, set small candles at their center, and release them onto the current, watching to see how far they drift, whether they sink or stay afloat, and in which direction they travel. Each outcome read as a divination of the woman's romantic future. It is a custom that, while rarely framed today as an offering to the Rusalka specifically, descends directly from the same impulse that once sent garlands into the water during Rusalnaya Nedelia. A recognition that the river holds something worth consulting, worth honoring, worth approaching with ceremony rather than indifference. In Ukraine particularly, the Mavka has experienced something closer to a deliberate cultural revival in recent years, distinct from quiet ethnographic survival, as Ukrainian artists, writers, and filmmakers have increasingly turned toward indigenous Slavic folklore as a wellspring of national cultural identity. The Mavka of Lesia Ukranka's Forest Song has found new audiences through animated films, contemporary illustration, and renewed theatrical productions. She has become, in this modern context, something more than a cautionary water spirit, a symbol of the deep, ancient connection between the Ukrainian people and the specific forests and rivers of their homeland, a folkloric figure reclaimed and celebrated rather than simply feared. This kind of revival, where old water spirits are repurposed as emblems of cultural continuity and rootedness rather than supernatural threat, is happening in various forms across the broader Slavic world. As younger generations rediscover folklore, their grandparents may have quietly let fade and find in these old stories something they did not expect, not superstition to be embarrassed by, but heritage worth preserving. It is worth pausing, as we near the close of our journey together, to ask why a belief like this endures at all, why a culture would spend centuries constructing such an elaborate, emotionally rich, ritually reinforced explanation for something as seemingly simple as the danger of drowning. The answer, when we look closely, is rarely simple superstition for its own sake. Drowning was, for the rural communities who told these stories, a genuine and constant danger, claiming children, fishermen, and young women with grim regularity in an age before swimming lessons, lifeguards, or modern medical rescue. A culture facing that kind of persistent, painful loss needs more than a practical warning. It needs a story substantial enough to carry the weight of real grief, flexible enough to explain why a beloved daughter walked into a river and never returned, and protective enough to keep the next generation a little more cautious near the water's edge. The Rusalka accomplished all of this at once. She was warning, eulogy, and explanation woven into a single haunting figure. And that triple function may be precisely why she proved so remarkably durable across so many centuries and so many distinct regional cultures. This pattern, we should note, is not unique to the Slavic world. Nearly every culture that has lived alongside dangerous water has produced some version of this same figure. The Scottish Kelpie luring riders to their deaths in lochs, the German Lorelei singing sailors onto the rocks of the Rhine, the various water spirits of Scandinavian, Baltic, and Celtic tradition, each one performing a remarkably similar cultural function despite arising independently across vastly different landscapes. Humanity, it seems, has reached again and again for the same fundamental story, whenever it has lived close to water that could take a life without warning, a beautiful, sorrowful spirit, born of tragedy, who reminds the living that the water deserves respect, caution, and a kind of reverence that simple practical advice could never fully instill on its own. The Rusalka belongs to this much larger, much older human tradition of making meaning out of danger, of wrapping grief in story until it becomes something a community can hold, pass down, and survive. And so we return, at last, to where we began. To a quiet pond at the edge of a rye field, mist curling along its surface in the hour before dawn. We have traveled a long way since that opening image. We have followed the Rusalka back through pre-Christian belief and the seasonal thinning of Rusalnaya Nedelia, across the regional variations that shaped her differently, from the Russian north to the Carpathian forests to the Balkan mountains, through the protective rituals and tender farewell ceremonies. Villagers once performed in her honor, and forward into the opera houses, novels, paintings, and fantasy worlds that have continued reshaping her for new generations. And yet, for all of that distance traveled, she remains, in some essential way, exactly what she always was. A story about water, about grief, about the women whose lives were cut short and whose sorrow a community needed somewhere to place. Perhaps that is the truest thing we can say about the Rusalka. After everything, she was never really about monsters at all. She was about memory, about a culture's refusal to let a drowned girl simply disappear beneath the surface without a story to mark that she had once been there, had once been loved, had once had a future the water took from her too soon. Whether you believe, as some still quietly do in villages along the Volga and the Dnieper, that something pale still rises beneath the birch trees during the first warm week of summer, or whether you see her now only as a beautiful and sorrowful piece of cultural memory, one thing remains unchanged from the very beginning of our journey together. The water remembers everything. And somewhere, in the quiet hour before dawn, it is still listening for the next story it will be asked to hold.